Editor Chapter 30. Eric looked at the figure standing beside him at the stern of the warship and, for the 100th time, was unable to prevent a broad grin breaking out across his face. Holt noticed the look and the grin and said in a sour tone, "It must lose its fascination after a while, surely." The Jar shook his head, his grin broadening. "Not for me," he replied cheerfully. "Every time is just as fresh as the first one." "I'm so glad that Scanady has such a lively sense of humour," the ranger said, scowling. It didn't serve his ill temper any better to see that several of the other Scanadians were grinning as well. In truth, he was a comical figure. He had forsaken his ranger's cloak and garb and was dressed in Scanadian clothing. Sheepskin vest, a short fur cloak, and woolen breeches, wound round with leather bindings from the knees down. At least they should have been wound from the knees down. In fact, since Holt was considerably smaller in stature than any of the adult Scanadians, the leggings were bound from his thighs down. The breeches sagged alarmingly at the crotch, and the sheepskin vest hung loosely on him, seemingly with room for another person of his own size inside. "It's your own fault," Eric replied, "for deciding to try to disguise yourself as one of us." "I told you," Holt muttered. "The Timberjay got a good look at me when they were chasing us near the border, and even without that, they have no reason to love anyone dressed as a ranger." "So I've heard," Eric said, still grinning. He bent to the sighting ring before him, checked the position of the floating lodestone, and adjusted the sight ring to conform with it. Then he read off the bearings to the next headland. "A little east of south," he said to himself. Then, raising his voice, he called to his men. "Look alive now. Sand Creek Bay lies beyond that next headland." There was an expectant shuffle on the decks of the warship as the Scanadians made sure their weapons were close to hand, although not obviously so. At a nod from Eric, the masthead lookout relayed the message to the other two warships sailing in close company with them. Very obviously making an effort not to grin, the warship skipper nudged Holt in the ribs with a not too gentle elbow. "You'd better put on your helmet," he told the ranger, whose countenance darkened even further than before as he reached for the huge horned helmet that every Scanadian warrior wore. This had been the most contentious piece of equipment. Eric had maintained that no Scanadian would ever appear in pure public without a helmet, and that there was no question for Holt's not wearing one. Yet the sizes were immense compared to what Holt considered to be his own perfectly normal head size. Even the very smallest helmet that Eric could find wobbled loosely on Holt and came down over his ears and eyes. By dint of much paddling with cloths, they had finally managed to get the helmet to sit more or less firmly on his head, but it still gapped amazingly all around. The Scanadians looked on with concealed amusement as Holt carefully placed the helmet on his head. Borso, who had joined the expedition on Ragnar's orders, shook his head and chuckled. The unwarlike hillman, who'd never seen a day of battle in his life, knew he looked more the part than Holt did. "Even if this turns out to be a wild goose chase," he said cheerfully, "it would have been worth to see this." Holt turned away angrily. It was a mistake. With the rapid head movement, his helmet became dislodged and tipped down over his eyes. He cursed quietly to himself, straightening the ridiculous headgear, and resigned himself to the smothered laughter of the Scanadians. They had been running before a quartering wind, but now, as Eric prepared to bring Wolfwind around the headland and across the wind, there was a flurry of activity on board as the big square sail was gathered in and furled to the cross yard. The long, heavy oars clattered in their thulls as the crew ran them out, and, before the ship had time to lose way, they began their smooth, rhythmic stroking. Glancing behind, Holt saw the other ships had shallow as 1 meter, but the Timberjay weren't aware of the fact and Holt and Eric had agreed that it made better sense to keep the enemy at a distance. 20 meters from the water's edge, Eric gave a brief command, and the oars on one side of the ship backed while the others went ahead, swinging the narrow craft through 90 degrees, virtually in her own length. Eric nodded to his second-in-command, who hurried to the tiller. Then the Jar stepped to the shoreward side of the ship and raised his voice in his Hilfman's storm-quelling bellow. "Ahoy, the beach!" he called, and Holt, standing close by, hastily moved a few paces further away. The timber standing in the center of the small group of the beach cupped his hands and called back. "I am Mr. O, commander of this force," he called. "Where is Slager?" Behind him, Holt heard a quick intake of breath and turned to see Borsa shaking his head sadly, his eyes downcast. Several of the other Scandinavians also exchanged glances at this incontrovertible confrontation that Slager had been involved in the plan. "Keep still," Holt warned them, and the men hurriedly masked their reactions. Eric was answering now with the story that he, Borsa, and Holt had agreed upon. Oberjar Ragnar was growing suspicious of our movements. It was too dangerous for Slager to come on this expedition. He would join us at Four Cork Island. There was a hurried consultation between the Timberjar leaders. "They don't like it," Eric muttered out of the side of his mouth. "They don't have to like it. They just have to believe it," Holt told him in the same undertone. After several minutes' discussion, Mr. O stepped away from the group and called again. "We expected Slager. How can we be sure we can trust you? Did he give any message? Any password?" On the ship, the men exchanged worried glances. This was the one eventuality they had feared. If Slager had arranged a password with the Timberjai, then their plan was spoiled. Of course, their main aim had already been achieved. They proved Slager's complicity in the plot. But now that they were here, the chance of taking 150 men out of the enemy's battle line without any loss to their own forces was tempting in the extreme. "Bluff it out," Holt said quickly. He already said he was expecting Slager, so they didn't need a password. Eric nodded. It made sense. "Look, horseman," Eric bellowed again. "I don't need a password, do I? I'm here to pick you up, and I'm risking my neck to do it. Now, if you choose to come aboard, then do so. If not, I'm going raiding and leaving you and Ragnar to your little war. Now you choose." Once again, there was an urgent consultation on the beach. They could see Mr. O's reluctance in his movements, but equally they could see him weighing his options, and after a long, searching glance at the wolf ship, he obviously decided he had nothing to fear from the skeleton crews of rowers on the three ships. "Very well," he called. "Bring your ships in and we'll board." But now Eric shook his head. "We'll bring you out on the skiffs," he called. "We can't beach here." Mr. O made an angry gesture. Obviously, he didn't like it when things didn't go precisely according to his wishes. "What are you talking about?" he yelled. "Slager beached his ships right here. I saw him do it." Eric moved to the bulwark and stood up on it, completely exposed to any possible fire from the beach. "Careful," Holt muttered, trying not to let his lips move. And tell me, horseman," Eric said, his voice heavy with sarcasm, "did Slager then load 50 men aboard his ship and take her off the beach?" There was a pause as the Timberjai leader thought through the reasoning in what Eric had said. Eric saw the hesitation and pressed on. "If I beach now and load your men aboard, we'll never get her off again, particularly with the tide falling the way it is." That seemed to clink it. Mr. O reluctantly signaled his agreement. "Very well," he called. "How many can you take at a time?" Eric resisted the temptation to heave a sigh of relief. 3 skiffs, 8 men each," he called. 24 at a time." Mr. O nodded. "All right, Canadian. Send in the skiffs." He turned to his lieutenant and set them to organizing the embarkation. On board Wolfwind, Eric was already signaling the other wolf ships to stand in closer and send their skiffs ashore with his own. Alright, I'd like to thank you very much for listening to read up to chapter 30. If you'd like to listen to read chapter 31, then please stay posted and hopefully I'll see you next time. Bye bye.